What's up everybody, I'm Greg, you're watching the Car Passion channel, and today I'm doing one of the most requested videos in the history of my channel. Your voices have been heard. Welcome to your guide for the ultimate Miata cooling system upgrade. I'm going to show you how to assemble and install a budget radiator and fan setup, how to wire in those fans, how to install a coolant reroute with the engine still in the car, as well as discuss why that reroute is so important. Because this video is probably going to be a little lengthy, I've included a table of contents right here in case you want to skip ahead. I want to kick things off with the radiator install, so let's get started. This is a CX Racing radiator and fan shroud setup. It was roughly $230. I would definitely consider this a budget upgrade, but since this car is going to be 99% street driven and it doesn't make a ton of power, I'm sure it's going to do just fine. If you bring your Miata to the track a lot or you make a bunch of power, you might want to consider a more serious upgrade, and I've linked below in the description an article that's very detailed and is going to tell you all about the various upgrades you want to make based on your power and the usage of your car. Most Chinese parts purchases from eBay, you just get a whole bag of parts with no instructions, so I'm going to try to figure out how this thing goes together. So drop the fans onto the shroud, and I want it to be like this because I'm going to end up wiring these together so they both kick on at the same time. Then drop these holders into the slot there. There's 4 on each fan. Set up your hardware with some washers, and finish bolting your fans to the shroud. The last step is to flip it over and install this weather stripping. This will help protect the aluminum on the radiator and help make a better seal. Now it's time to install the fan shroud on the radiator. It looks like you can use your stock fans on this radiator, and those fans will actually cool completely fine. The only reason I went with the low pros is to generate more room for my intercooler piping. So I suppose some of you are wondering by now why I'm making these cooling upgrades. Well, there's a couple reasons. Number one, if I'm pulling a long hill and the AC is cranking, the car will start to run a little warm, and that's actually pretty common, especially if you have an all-original cooling system. Number two, I do plan on taking this car drifting, just like I hinted at in the 240SX drifting video, and I want to make sure the cooling system is tip-top ready to go because it's a 3-hour drive each way and I don't want to get stranded up there. Number 3, you can see some coolant residue coming out right here. Got a crack in my radiator just under this lip here. So it's basically a ticking time bomb at this point. Anytime you do cooling system work, it's also a great opportunity to replace your hoses. If you look really closely underneath that hose, it's actually starting to leak a little bit, and that's an indicator that that hose is old, unhealthy, and needs to be replaced. This thing's now ready to go in, but first we have to get the old one out. Start by removing the radiator cap. Drain the coolant from the plug in the bottom of your radiator. Disconnect your upper hose, overflow line, lower radiator hose, unplug your fans, and remove one 12mm bolt from each side of the radiator. Lift, lift. I should also mention that I did have my splash guard off prior to starting this job due to some other work I was doing on the car, and the splash guard is a very important part of your car's cooling system. You see, 2 bad things happen when you don't have a splash guard. Number 1, the air goes in the mouth of the bumper and goes right underneath the radiator. Number 2, after the air goes underneath the radiator, it goes back up into the engine bay and it causes a high pressure situation. So imagine you have your engine bay right here and you have your radiator. You have fresh air coming in from the outside trying to get through the radiator into the engine bay, but if you have too much pressure here, the air can't efficiently get through that radiator. So if you don't have a splash guard, you need to install one on your car. The last thing you have to do to get your new radiator ready to drop in is swap out the bushings and mounts from your old radiator. Okay, minor setback. The intercooler piping does not fit with the fans, but lucky for me, the fans do include ricer style mounting, and now I get to show you guys how to use it. Take the little foam sticky pads, stick them onto the little mounting feet. You're going to use these long, straight zip tie style things, and you stick it through the pad, and it actually goes through the radiator to the other side. Now just flip the radiator over and zip on these little discs. There she is, all nice and pretty, mounted up, and more space to work. I'm a fan. Wiring up of the fans is pretty easy. I'm just going to solder the blues together, solder the blacks together, and then solder those to the stock connector off of the OEM fan, and then plug it into the car's harness. Now that you have your radiator in, it's time for the fun stuff. What I've got here is an M-tuned coolant reroute, as well as a few extra hoses I've sourced myself for a cleaner install. Please keep in mind that I'm installing this kit on a 1.6 liter car. If you have a 1.8 or even a reroute from another brand, your installation might vary slightly. I've included below in the description a link to M-Tune's PDF instructions that might help you along the way if you have a 1.8. But the question you're probably all asking right now is why? Why the coolant reroute? And there's actually a really simple explanation. So Mazda had this wonderful B6 engine way before the Miata ever came around, and it was always in front wheel drive vehicles. So picture this engine just turned this way 90 degrees in a front wheel drive. The coolant came from this side of the head, which was right here, into the radiator. So when the Miata came around, Mazda said, you know what, we've already got this great engine, we'll just flip it around, drop it in, pull the coolant from the other side of the head, and it'll be all good. Well, the problem is this rear cylinder, number 4, does not get adequate coolant flow, and it can run hot, it can cause detonation and other problems. So when you install the coolant reroute, you're basically routing the coolant the way that Mazda originally engineered it. I'm going to start right here at the thermostat housing by unplugging the thermal switch and removing it from the housing. Next, remove the top of the housing along with the thermostat. Clean off any old gasket left on the housing. Now install your block-off plate, and don't forget a gasket or silicone sealer. Then drop your thermal switch back in. Now we get to the most difficult part of the install, which is the rear coolant housing. You gotta start by generating as much room for yourself as possible. First thing I wanna do is remove the ignition coils. You got a 12mm bolt on each side and one 12mm bolt behind the head. This is the hole that the 12mm bolt goes through in the back of the head. Now remove your crank angle sensor, and remember that anytime you remove this, you're going to need to reset your ignition timing with a timing light. That little 12mm bolt right there, the one you use to adjust the cast, that's the only bolt you have to remove to take it off the engine. Try not to spin this because it's going to go back on exactly the same orientation it came off. There's the beast, your stock coolant housing. You can see there's a 12mm bolt right there on top, and exactly opposite of that, down on the bottom, there's another one. ECU coolant temperature sensor, and right there is where your heater hose connects. So you want to start by disconnecting that temperature sensor and pulling off your heater hose. Alright, on to the last nut. There it is right there. I'm not sure if this is true for all reroutes, but if you're using the M-tuned version, that stud has to come out. So the nut that you just removed to get the housing off, put that nut back on. Then use another nut of the same size, put that one on the stud, lock them together, and then back the stud out. I'll show you what I mean. Actually stole a nut off of one of the wiper blades to do this with, FYI. Pro tip. Once these two nuts are locked together, you're going to put your wrench on the inner nut and use that one to back the stud out. The fruits of your labor. Last thing I gotta do is clean all the old gasket off the back of the head, and we're ready to install the kit. Cleaning the gasket off the back of the head, possibly the most annoying part of this entire job. But you know what's more annoying? Putting it all back together and having a leak at that rear housing. That means you gotta take it all back out again and start over. I take a little razor like this by hand and get all the big chunks of gasket off. And then I have other various things like wire brushes, shop towels, sandpaper, And equally important, a good flashlight and an inspection mirror so you can really make sure you're doing a good job. Once that back surface is clean, you're ready to install the reroute. With the M-tuned reroute, you're going to install the large hose port, but not the heater core hose port. You'll do that after the housing is installed. Coolant temp sensor. Putting the new housing on is pretty tricky, and it requires 2 hands, and it's going to be pretty much impossible to film. So this is the best advice I can give you. Put your gasket on. Don't forget your gasket. I hold the housing by the top like this, and I come in from the bottom and thread on this bottom bolt. Just get it started by hand. Then the housing will kind of hold itself in place, and you can work on this top bolt. It's not that difficult. It's not that bad. We're almost there. All right, that housing's in place, and the bolts are finger tight at this point. And this is what it looks like from the other side. You'll need an Allen wrench like this to tighten the bolts the rest of the way. Now thread in the heater hose port. Since the coolant temp sensor is now placed on the other side of the housing, unfortunately you do have to extend your harness a few inches. I added about 5 inches to the harness, which is plenty long enough to get it to the new location of the sensor. Now the heater core hose can go back on, and again, this is really an excellent time to replace these hoses. Well, the good news is all the hard stuff is done. Next up, we have our inline thermostat housing. This is a 2-piece housing that unthreads, and inside you've got a thermostat. I'm not going to take this apart because the 2 wrenches that I used to assemble this piece a long time ago, I don't have anymore. But it's really easy, I promise. Now, inside of this housing, you can see there's a hole in the thermostat itself. That hole has got to be installed vertically when you put this housing in. I bought all these miscellaneous hoses from siliconeintakes.com. The M-Tune reroute just comes with one giant hose and it loops around in the engine bay, and I just don't really like how it looks. So what I'm going to do is assemble this whole thing out of the car and then just pop the whole system on, tighten it down, and we're going to be good to go. This is what mine looks like when it's all assembled, and this thing is ready to go into the car. The hose is in place and the reroute is officially completed. The rest of this install is smooth sailing, so let me outline it real quick for you. Reinstall your CAS, reinstall your coils, set your ignition timing, jack the front of the car up off the ground, fill up the radiator all the way, start the car and let it idle. It's going to drink some of that coolant out of the radiator. Just let it come all the way up to operating temperature, adding coolant as necessary. Make sure all your lines are hooked up, all your plugs are plugged in, everything's put back together the way it was, and you're good to go. Well guys, if you enjoyed the video, let me know down in the comments section. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button. And as for me, I gotta take this spare differential off to get welded because, like I said, I'm taking this thing drifting soon, and I'm gonna take you guys along with me. I'll see you in the next video.
Back from the dead.